function is to serve as a watchdog over environmental law and policy and decision making in the province. And the Commissioner, Diane Sachs, is a very passionate advocate on climate change issues, and that's the team that I lead. We report on government progress in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. That's the job that my team is responsible for. This is the report that we released at the end of September, and that report was what we tried to do is talk about everything that had happened in the post-election period, and also to report on where the monies from the cap and trade program were being spent. We had that information and we wanted to provide public information about where that money was being spent. This is an outline of the report. We have a number of appendices. There's 2 appendices in the report on policy tools to fight climate change, and then the revenue from cap and trade. And that is an overview of where the monies from the cap and trade program were being spent. What we tried to do is talk about what happened once the new government was put in place, and what did they do to some of the climate policy that had been established under the previous government. So these are all the areas that we talked about in the first chapter, and you can see about the 4th section is in 2018 we saw a wrenching halt to all of the programs and policy that had been put in place to deal with climate change in Ontario. Here's some slides that talk about the impacts that we're already feeling in Ontario. So we know that we're warming faster than the global average, and it varies depending on the topography and the geography within the province, but there are significant changes. This is a visual. It's very good sometimes to visualize what is happening in terms of temperature, and this is over time. As you can see, the temperature change in Toronto has gone on average from 7.6 up, now on average 10.8. Next. And what have we witnessed over the past years? A lot of flooding, fires. I don't have the drought pictures there, but we've seen a lot of the impacts that are very much associated with the projections of a changing climate. Next. We're seeing increased Lyme disease, some other infectious diseases. As the vectors move north into Ontario, we're seeing increased infectious diseases, along with some other things that have significant impacts on our health. And keep going. We profiled this in our report as well in terms of the losses now that we're beginning to see in Ontario from the impacts of climate change. And what we've done here is these are just the insured losses. These are not including the uninsured losses, which begs the question of who picks up the cost of those. So as you can see, there is a trend line, and the first 9 months of 2018, it was $1.2 billion worth of losses just in 2018 alone. So it's not a trend that bodes well. Okay. The report profiles what were we doing, where were we going, where was Ontario headed in terms of climate change. Okay. So in 2016, so you're saying, why are we using the 2016 numbers? Those are the most recent numbers that are available through the National Inventory Report, which is produced by the federal government. So that's the most recent data we have. So we don't actually have the data for 2017 yet, which of course is when the cap and trade program came in, but we generally were headed in the right direction. And again, I probably don't need to tell this audience, Ontario is the 2nd largest emitter of greenhouse gas emissions in Canada. This can be misleading. This is relative to 1990, so that's a center line, 100%, and this is relative to 1990. We were making progress, population was going up, but this shows the decoupling between emissions and population growth and GHG intensity. We were headed in the right direction, okay? This is a point that I want to emphasize. What we're hearing now a lot about is focusing on industry and having industry take responsibility for emissions in Ontario. The point that we try to emphasize in all of our reports is industry is not that's not where the most emissions are coming from in Ontario. As you can see, more of Ontario's greenhouse gas emissions are directly from individual activities rather than from industry. So home buildings, residential homes is on the top, light blue, and it's the transportation sector in Ontario, which is the largest sector for greenhouse gas emissions. That is, you know, all the driving around that is required often for the way that we've built out our communities. That's the freight emissions that are associated with the trucking industry and shipping goods and services here. So I just really wanted to emphasize where the emissions are coming from in Ontario. It is not primarily from industry. Next slide. So you'll see this is a change in emissions relative to 1990. So transportation has definitely gone up. Buildings emissions from space cooling has gone up. Waste emissions have gone up, but every other emissions sector has actually gone down since 1990. And the far one, of course, is electricity, and that was from the coal phase-out. That is the largest single greenhouse gas initiative in North America to date to phase out coal. Ontario is proud that we did that. So what that has provided us with, the key thing that has provided us with, is a very clean electricity grid. We now need to take advantage of that clean electricity grid and shift our fossil fuel consumption away from fossil fuels and towards electricity. So what are the other things that happened along the way? Well, we had some improvements by industry at codes and standards, energy conservation programs. We did have the Green Energy Act, which is now being repealed. We had better rules on land use, international leadership. We had climate law, and we had cap and trade. We don't know yet. We haven't seen the numbers, but all of the indicators around fuel consumption and everything showed we were headed in the right direction. So what happened? This is how cap and trade, this is our mock-up of cap and trade, and you often will see people, the government, this is sort of our interpretation of the government's slide deck, because often the high carbon Ontario down here is represented by industry and smoking smokestacks, and we really want to emphasize that is not where the emissions are coming from. So we swapped it out and put in the truth about where are the emissions coming from. Carbon price revenues, I'm going to talk briefly about this. I'm going to assume this is an audience that knows what was happening with the revenues. There was a cap and trade system in, allowances were purchased. Those revenues went back to the government. They were used to fund energy efficiency improvements in hospitals and schools and a number of other municipalities across the board. And that was, helping to build the economy towards a low carbon future. And in our report, we've tried to give real life stories about how those monies were being used. So we've talked a lot about, some industry players that were using the money to finance electricity retrofits or energy retrofits. We talked about how municipalities were using the money. So if you want to find out sort of real life stories, that was the kind of thing that we really wanted to tell in our report. So this is what it did. It raised $2.9 billion since January 2017, and we've shown you there what was that money invested in. Social housing, 19,000 social housing retrofits. Hospitals, schools, universities, colleges. 1.9 billion was spent, so there's about $1 billion that went unspent, and we don't really know where that money's going yet. 74% was into hospitals, schools, municipalities, the kinds of things that, the entities that could take action to reduce their emissions. Okay, next. And there's lots of co-benefits associated with reducing our fossil fuel emissions. We have environmental sustainability, energy resiliency, lots of co-benefits. So one of the key things is, if we did increase the energy efficiency in Ontario, what would that look like? What would that do for the economy? And these are some numbers that were calculated under the Pan-Canadian framework, but that's, quite a number of jobs and a real stimulus to the economy if we really took energy efficiency seriously. So what happened? Well, it all came to a wrenching halt in June. So Regulation 386 was the one that banned entities from trading in the carbon market, buying or selling allowances. So that was the first stake in the ground, I guess, if you want to say, in terms of what the direction the government would be taking. So that signaled that Ontario would no longer be participating in the cap and trade market. Subsequently, there was a bill that was put forward and subsequently passed, Bill 4, which was the Cap and Trade Cancellation Act. And the government clawed back at a lot of the funding, most of the funding, to all of the programs that had been funded through the cap and trade and asked for a lot of those revenues to be sent back to them. The federal government just recently announced that they actually would be stepping in with $420 million to provide that funding to the entities, some of the entities that had lost money, universities, schools, hospitals, to continue with energy efficiency programs. So where are we now? We don't have a climate policy. We don't have any emissions targets. We don't have any money for solutions. So this is the situation in which we currently find ourselves. Now, you are here because you're talking, the government is now consulting through a portal for ideas on what they should do, what the government should do. So some of the things that they did, the government, they canceled a number of renewable energy contracts. And as most of you likely are aware, the federal government is going to bring in the federal government backstop in January. They'll bring in an output-based pricing system in January, apply that to industrial players, and in April, then the fuel distribution tax comes in. All right. So what did we do? We talked about what do we think needs to happen in Ontario. What needs to happen now? The government's sort of canceled everything that went on. So one of the things we did is we made the argument that in order for industry to understand what they need to invest in, where they need to go, they need policy certainty, right? We can't have a whiplash every 4 years back and forth. So one of the things that we did is we looked at some other jurisdictions that have put in place something a little bit more that gives you a guideline as to where the government is going to be going in terms of law and policy. And so we looked at the UK Climate Change Act, and keep going. And what the UK does is it sets carbon budgets. And so they have established carbon budgets, 5-year carbon budgets, way out to the future, 12 years in advance. So what that does, it signals, it doesn't say what the policy is going to be, it doesn't say what the government is going to do to get there, but what it does do is it signals to industry that this is where we're heading, and you need to be cognizant of the fact that this is where the government's going to be going. And that was something that was brought in 2008, and this is one of the recommendations that we made, is that the government needs to provide that long-term signal to investors and business. So that was one of our key ones. So the other thing we did is we said, okay, well, that's one big stroke of what we think that the government should do, but what are the other tools at the government's disposal for reducing emissions? And so we talked about it in terms of being a three-legged stool. We can make polluters pay. Well, we've just given up one of the key tools with giving up cap and trade. So what are the other tools at our disposal? We can find other ways to pay for solutions, or use the stick of regulation, which is often a far more costly approach to driving emissions. What needs to happen in each of the sectors to get us there, and what's the least cost pathway? And one of the things that we discovered is really, we have, as I mentioned, a low carbon grid. We need to shift a massive amount of our transportation and buildings over to electrification. So that begins with conservation and fuel switching. We did still talk about what does polluter pay mean? And we're not giving up on polluter pay. Obviously, the federal government is coming in with a carbon price. But what does that do? Well, it sends a signal that industry and individuals can respond to. And so fundamentally, that's what we tried to do, a diagram showing why does polluter pay work? Well, we can look at a number of examples around other things where we've had to pay, and that does drive behavior shift. So in the absence of cap and trade revenue, what are the other ways that the government could find to pay for solutions? So we've just given up all that money. So we looked at some other ideas. Well, one of the things that government can do is use its purchasing power to drive low carbon purchasing, and it can improve public health, and it can support the clean tech sector, and it can lead by example. So one of the recommendations we made was the government use its purchasing power to start driving those kinds of initiatives. The other thing we've talked about in a couple of our reports is fossil fuel subsidies. Most people don't think about fossil fuel subsidies in Ontario, and I didn't when the commissioner first phoned me when she was in Paris and said, what have we said about fossil fuel subsidies? And I said, well, we've never talked about it because we don't have that. Well, I was wrong, because we usually think about fossil fuel subsidies from a production point of view in Alberta. But in Ontario, the argument that we're making here is that we have certain fuels that we're taxing at a preferential tax rate. So colored diesel, for example, is taxed at a lower tax rate than regular diesel. Colored diesel is a diesel that's used on farms and some other equipment. So it works out to be about $625 million. So it's a subsidy in the sense that we're not taxing it at the rate that we would other fuels, other diesel. So what could we do with 625? So we did a little mock-up on, what could that buy you if you had that money? So that's one of the things. And that was in the former Climate Change Action Plan, getting rid of fossil fuel subsidy. And then we talked about private investment. Well, how can we leverage private investment? How can we get investors to start moving their money? Because really, if we can't shift the financial community towards low carbon investments, that's going to be a big challenge. Lots of money is still locked up in high fossil fuel sectors. So that was one of the areas that we talked about, and we looked at where are the pension plans? How can we get private investors to move in that direction? So I talked about regulation. Regulation is what governments tend to do because they do it better than anyone else, right? So what are the regulatory tools that we could use? Well, you could use a fee-based system, or you could do a ban on, organic substances going into landfills. I mean, the reality is we phased out coal in Ontario via regulation. We've done it before, right? So regulation can work. Unfortunately, it sometimes is a lot more costly to an economy than it does than is a cap and trade system or a price on carbon, which sends the signal directly to decision makers. Regulation, the cost tends to be hidden to most people. So the final chapter that we talked about was adaptation, right? My role and my mandate is to report on how are we doing in reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but we can't ignore the other side of the coin, which is how are we going to adapt to the change that we know is coming? And next slide is called upon the government to really identify where are our risks and vulnerabilities. What do we stand to face in the face of a changing climate? Do we have up-to-date floodplain mapping? Do we have infrastructure that's going to withstand the temperatures, the floods, the water that we know that is going to come? And so what we called upon the government to do is to really do that kind of broad-based vulnerability assessment, risk assessment. And the signals that I am getting, at least from the government, is that this is going to form a large part of their climate plan, very much focused on adaptation. The challenge is that we still want them to be focusing on the mitigation question. So this is sort of the broad stroke, what we're calling upon the government to do, to set long-term science-based targets. The previous government had targets in law, under the Climate Change Mitigation and Low Carbon Economy Act. Those targets were repealed. We don't have targets anymore. The minister may make targets and may change those targets. What we're calling for is to set long-term science-based targets and using that kind of approach of the UK, setting budgets well in advance, so that sends a long-term signal to industry and investors. Determine what is the pathway, right? We need to see the analytics behind this is actually going to give us what we are looking for. Put the tools in place, monitor, report, and annually do a check. So it's kind of that check and improve that we're calling for. And the next slide, it's not the one that I thought I put in. Anyhow, I put in a number of the really more specific recommendations that we made in our report on page 203 to 205. But it's the things like using a fee-based system, or calling for a ban on organics, or using the building code to increase building requirements to build to net zero. Those kinds of things are the real tools that we need if we're going to start to move in the right direction. And these are the kinds of things that we would like to see in the climate plan that the government is working on.